In 2006, 2 men were arrested and sent to federal prison for being involved in a mortgage fraud that cost them millions in restitution. 40 acres of properties known as the Greenleaf neighborhood had to stop construction and were left to rot for years. Even if someone wanted to continue construction, they couldn't, as the project was never meant to work. The homes had been described as shells of houses and were in poor quality, without the proper infrastructure to be completed. The properties were supposed to be built on a community septic, but no one bothered and the houses were built on nothing. The houses were in such poor condition that when construction ended, the Forsyth Fire Department didn't even want to use them for fire training. So of the 60 proposed lots, 18 were in various states of disrepair, and the neighborhood of asbestos-filled homes known as Greenleaf was abandoned and dubbed a crime scene. This is information anyone can find online about the strange and, to me, fascinating little piece of abandoned history. Not just one house, but a whole neighborhood of abandoned homes left to deteriorate all because of some criminal activity? Sign me up. This was the mindset that had me volunteering my well-being in the name of exploration. Let's back up. I'm a big fan of urban exploration, especially if the place I'm exploring has a tragic history that left ideas and dreams in the trash. It's not the cheeriest of hobbies, I'll admit, but there's something so chilling about the quiet loneliness of some of these places. The questions of why or what if that run through my mind as I take in a towering Ferris wheel or a dying city's abandoned high school. The things left behind in a panic as people were forced to jump ship, or in this case, a neighborhood that never even had a chance to live. The flight to Georgia was uneventful. All I could focus on was getting my tour. I wanted to go there at dawn, get that nice sunrise through the trees kind of thing. I'd be coming in at about 3 p.m., so I took up residence in a B&B close to Greenleaf. My excursion would have to wait till morning. Until then, I'd be checking my gear, researching the neighborhood, and partaking in some local takeout. Not much sleep was to be had that night. I brought with me a rather simple but effective camera, the Canon M50. Not too glamorous, but I was more there to capture the memory, not show it off to the world. I brought extra batteries, all charged up that night, as well as a second memory card. I didn't want to come all this way only to get half a day's footage and get shut down due to lack of memory. I headed out at 4:30 a.m. The air was still rather cold, so I brought a couple of layers under my fall jacket. I'd heard there was some security that patrolled around the homes, but they didn't seem to mind much if someone was hanging out, as long as they didn't destroy anything. I certainly had no intention of breaking or stealing anything. Something about these abandoned places felt frozen in time, and to mess with that felt disrespectful. The sign was a fitting entrance to the neighborhood. Being left for nature to reclaim, vines and foliage had crawled over the edges, trying to suffocate the stone. Behind the sign, the road leading in was also not very clear of weeds growing up through the cracked and shattered pavement. But one could still drive into town for now, so I took the bumpy road through the trees. The path led into the suburb on a hill above the homes and gave a really nice overall view of what I was heading into. I could see lines of roofs in several rows that at a glance looked very average for a nice forest neighborhood. However, the closer I drove, the more you could start to see something was off, as several of the houses had holes in their second stories, as well as missing windows altogether. I drove down the street lined on each side with the defunct homes, just as the sun started to lighten up the sky, but still left the structures looming in dark shadows of uneasy disrepair all around me. You could hear many birds chirping as they woke up in the surrounding trees and from within the homes themselves. Perfect timing. I parked in the driveway of a random home at the end of a cul-de-sac, smirking at the thought that it could have once been someone's normal coming home from work feeling. I pulled up the hood of my jacket and stepped out of the car to take a better look. This home had the first sign of graffiti I'd seen. Marked crudely on the garage were the words, "Homes of the Damned." Cute. Kids think they're so edgy when it comes to marking up places like this, often wanting to give it an even creepier vibe. After a quick shot of the front yard, I headed up the steps and into the front door, which was missing. The light had started to come through the windows, or lack thereof, and cast warm rays of orange and red across the floor. The home was clear of any furniture or evidence that anyone had ever lived there. I assumed all the houses would look this way, as they were never actually lived in. There was, however, rubble on the floor from the walls and ceilings either being torn apart by scavengers or simply eroded away by the elements. The hole in the roof allowed a patch of rotten wood to form on the stairs, leading up to the second floor that perfectly reflected the shape of the hole. I imagine it had been there for many rainstorms. As I headed upstairs, I smelt the wet rot of the wood that made up the exposed ceiling above. Everywhere I stepped, it crunched with broken out glass of a few windows that were once installed, and the resulting openings allowed cool breeze to wisp through the structure. At the top, I saw what made this different from all the other abandoned structures I'd visited. The whole second floor was unfinished. It looked like a skeleton of a house with wooden beams separating what would have been rooms and bare rotting planks along the floor that creaked desperately when I stepped upon them. Records say the construction crew had to stop what they were doing and evacuate the crime scene, and it sure looked like it. Through an attic-looking room, I found that hole I'd spotted from the car on the way in. It looked torn out rather than unfinished, and I could start to see some clouds moving in as I gazed over the other houses. It shouldn't have been scheduled to rain that weekend, but I knew there would be some clouds, so it didn't bother me. I just knew I'd have to bring some warm clothes to fight off the wind that was also picking up that morning. As much as I enjoyed the view, I couldn't stop. I had to tour as much of this forgotten town as I could. I kept my car where it was and chose to walk from house to house. They all looked like they were supposed to have the same layout and appearance, yet in this stage of varying completeness, they were all very different to walk through. Many of the houses were incomplete upstairs. A select few didn't even have stairs to get up there. Some were missing their doors, windows, and garage, while others looked just about complete. I'd seen every one of these types by noon and was ready to take a break. I wanted to take cover in a mostly complete house at the end of the street, rather deep into the neighborhood. By this time, the clouds had rolled in and covered the sun, shrouding the streets in a gloomy gray. The wind had been making my hands and face numb, so I pulled open the cracked front door and slipped inside. I shivered, happy to be out of the chill, and squinted at the dim lighting of this house, taking a moment to adjust before freezing in my tracks. The entrance looked into the living room, and I could see from there what no other house contained: chairs. Slowly, I headed into the room and found 4 nice oak chairs sitting in a weird circle in the middle of the room. Had someone dragged these in here? Were there squatters living here? The questions ceased when an even more alarming discovery drew my attention towards the dining room. Voices. My heart began to pound at the idea that I had found a house occupied by potentially dangerous intruders. I began to back up when the source of the voice peered into the room. A blonde woman in her 50s, done up with red lipstick and blush. She had nice pearls and a pink dress that went down to her knees and matching pink heels. "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were my son. And who might you be?" she asked, furthering my confusion. Was she another urban explorer? She didn't look the type. A little too ready for dinner with the family. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I'm just exploring the neighborhood," I replied, unsure of what I was even intruding in on. "We don't get many visitors here, so we're always welcoming of guests. Would you like to join us? We're just about to sit down for lunch," she replied with a genuine yet unsettling constant smile. "What? You're what?" I was cut off by the sound of steps coming down the stairs. Looking up, I saw what looked like a 25-year-old guy joining me in the living room with some nicely combed brown hair, pressed black pants, and a nice button-down red shirt. These people sure didn't look like they'd been rummaging around in dirt-covered structures. "Hey, who's this?" he asked with a similarly friendly smile. "A guest of the neighborhood. I was just asking if she'd like to stay for lunch," his mother answered. I was stunned in confusion, but had to know what was going on here, so I simply nodded in response to her hopeful stare. It made her light up and squeal with joy. "Oh, good! Please, come in, lunch is almost ready," she instructed and disappeared back into the dining room towards the kitchen area. The confusion didn't stop once I entered the dining room. There was a full-size table set up with 5 chairs, 2 on each side and 1 on the end. Each place had a plate and silverware sitting there. All of these household things were worn, tarnished metal, cracked wood like the rest of the house. Looking up, you could see a hole in the ceiling that looked up into the attic room. Rubble still adorned the floor like the rest of the home. This place was supposed to be abandoned, all right, but these people acted like they lived there and nothing was wrong with it. I took out my camera in hopes of filming the strange family and their activities, but the son quickly put a hand up to block the lens. "Hey, what are you doing? You can't just come into our home and film us like that, so rude," he scolded, and for an instant I felt cruel having attempted it before remembering how weird this all was. Still, I didn't want to get kicked out. I had to see what these people were up to, so I nodded and put the camera back in its bag. At that moment, we were joined by the dad of the house? A man looking to be about mid-50s like the wife, with a full-on pipe in his grinning teeth. The family had a real Leave It to Beaver look to it rather than something more modern. "Well, hi there! You must be our lunch guest," he boasted, oddly knowing this despite the wife not telling him anything about me that I could have seen. Yeah, thanks for having me." I tried to sound like I wasn't confused. "I'm sure Janet told you that we don't have many guests around here. Welcome!" His over-cheeriness matched the wife's with equal amounts of creep. The dad took a seat at the head of the table, as the son did likewise at his right side. I sort of wanted to be as far from the group as I could, so I took the lone seat at the far left side closest to the entrance. It didn't seem to bother the others that I wasn't being all that social with him. Still, I wanted some information without breaking whatever this facade was. "So, how long have you all lived here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, the wife and I moved here about 25 years ago?" he recalled, though there was no way that was true. "Really? I didn't think this neighborhood was around back then," I replied in a maybe I don't know what I'm talking about kind of way. For a second, I saw through that never-ending smile, and it was frightening. He dropped it just long enough for me to catch it, creating a sort of uneven scowl that vanished again into a smile. Something was wrong about that statement that had upset him for a second. Instead of correcting me, he ignored the comment altogether and addressed his son instead. "How's that science project coming along?" he asked, as his son watched me this whole time. He replied without taking his eyes off me, and it was really starting to make my skin crawl. "Just finished it, Dad. It's going to win for sure," he said with the fake confidence that matched his fake personality. I was starting to think up a polite way out of here. Before I could speak up, however, the wife came back in with a platter of their lunch and set it in the middle before taking a seat. Now I could feel them all watching me. "Hey, did you know Timothy here is the top 5% of Greenleaf University?" Janet beamed. The absurdity made me chuckle, breaking my politeness. "That's not a college," I commented down at the plate in front of me before I could keep it in. The table went silent. I could feel them staring daggers into me before Janet tried to move on with a strange stutter. He's a good boy." An awkward silence fell on the table before the startling sound of metal on bone made me jump as the wife slammed her hand down on the cover of the food. Glancing up at that thin, pale hand, I saw what looked like movement beneath her skin. I recoiled at what I saw before she pulled the lid away to reveal a platter of fresh rogue-killed raccoon laying raw and open before us. It was more than I could handle. If this was an elaborate joke, they'd taken it too far than I cared to see. I stood from my seat and backed up a step. No, I uttered and turned from the table. The others moved and stood with me. "What's the matter? Never had home cooking before?" the man asked before giving a broken-sounding laugh. "It's fresh from," the wife added, unable to finish her claim. I turned back to the family, intending to make up any excuse I could to get out of there, but I had no words. Various sores had begun to form on their faces and exposed arms and chests. Their hair was falling out in chunks, and an increasingly horrific smell of decomposition was starting to surround me. Their once pale skin was now a sickly gray, and the more they moved, the more pieces of them were falling off. A finger here, a tooth there, peppering the table with their parts. Beneath the surface, I could see more living movement. They were insects of some kind, and ones I'd never seen before. Large, 2-inch-long parasites that gripped onto the bones and muscles of these corpses, controlling them, but now failing to do so. I could see them within their mouths, behind their eyes, under their rotting skin. These people were never alive, or at least I hope they weren't. I turned and ran, filled with so much terror I couldn't initially recall which way I needed to go. Frantic, I found myself in the foyer, scrambling to pull open the lodge door as I heard the rustling of many steps, many things crawling behind me. It gave me strength to pry open the door, and despite my pulled muscles, I ran out into the front yard. The clouds had taken residence over the whole neighborhood, making it a grim place to be. As I stood in the yard trying to get my direction back to the car and on track, my heart sank when I saw more. More families were emerging from their half-finished homes with half-finished bodies, observing me like their next meal. I moved quickly down the street as more peeked from their front doors, 30, maybe 40 of them, filling the air with the smell of death and rot. I could hear the sound of insects moving about with so many of them on each side of me. Salvation in sight. I'd never been happier to see that SUV in all my life. Figures lumbered on broken legs behind me, yelling out with false language mixed with screeching nightmares. I barreled into the car and fired it up, taking one more look at the zombie-like creatures falling apart on the road into hundreds of alien parasites. That was all I needed to see. Pulling into gear, I tore out of the suburb, leaving the truly damned neighborhood behind me. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know everything about what I had witnessed, but here's what I can decipher. No human beings lived in those homes. The people I met were just puppets of whatever those bugs beneath were. They were able to keep these corpses up and running as long as I believed in the lie they were spitting. They were, I believe, trying to learn how to be human, but didn't quite know how to do it yet. By 2016, Greenleaf was demolished, and there were no reports of parasitic people living in the homes. I could feel happy, pretend the problem was destroyed along with the houses, but I'm more cautious than that. Especially because I'm pretty sure I saw movement in the trees as I fled. So if you ever meet a strange family of people who don't quite act right, be careful. Keep your wits about you, and question everything.